So we spoke about specific gravity was one. You said there's RVP, vapor lock, some of those other things. So if you want to go into a little bit more, give us a general what you're talking about with them. You don't have to get too technical if you don't want to. We appreciate if you do, but at the end of the day,
No, I just wanted to bring up the so-called distillation curve of fuel. I mentioned the C16 before, where you have fuels that you have a lot of intake manifold temperature, especially in forced induction systems, as opposed to a nitrous environment where you have very cold intake manifold environment. Not only is volatility an issue in those applications, but the distillation curve is sometimes a factor as well, because you can have the fuel vapor lock because it has too low a distillation curve, especially at the beginning or so-called 10% evaporation rate, and the other end, which is the end point where all of the fuel is boiled away. So maybe a little bit more technical at another time, but your viewers may be interested in looking at that distillation curve when it comes to selecting a fuel. I mentioned it specifically, we have the MR12 and a Pro 6, which is a little bit different in that it's a little higher octane, but also one of the top power producing motocross fuels. That fuel has such a low boiling point, and with an engine sitting right on top of, or rather right underneath the fuel tank, we had to modify that, and we now have a Pro 6 regular and a Pro 6 HT for high temperature. The fuel has a very low boiling point and causes the fuel to boil in the fuel tank, causing vapor lock. So most racers have experienced vapor lock. I suggest that you look at those numbers when you're looking at your race fuel. It could be a very important consideration.
okay. In general, as we said earlier too, we've seen more of a shift towards the ethanol kind of being what people are gravitating to for higher horsepower setups, especially in four-cylinder and forced induction applications. Um, I know you guys make a range of ethanol products other than C85. C85 is kind of the traditional one, I would say. I think it's one of your older ethanol products. But it's what's kind of known, it's what's used in a lot of the classes for like sport front wheel drive and stuff like that in the States. I believe they use M1 now, but a lot of the average weekend racers use it because they can also go and use Pump E85. While we don't have Pump E85 here, you know, it does give you some flexibility in your guys' applications up there. But for here, which one of the varieties do you have that you would say, or what are the benefits of, or pros and cons of each of the different types of ethanol products that you have?
So currently have three specific ethanol fuels. We have several other spec fuels that are ethanol enhanced, but for the import market, it's typically these three products that they're interested in. X85, which would compare with what a street car would use E85. So the X85 is the equivalent, at least in label, of an E85 fuel.
So that one is more like your traditional 85% ethanol, 15% pump gas, but just consistent.
So a typical E85 product that you might buy at a gas pump, because they are blended on a jobber level rather than a manufacturer level, you tend to get inconsistencies in the amount of ethanol mixed with the fuel.
I think the legal limit in the States is 70%, right?
It ranges from actually 51% to 85%. And that's why a lot of times you can buy a fuel, an ethanol fuel, that is sold as an E85. It might only contain, let's just say, 55% ethanol. It's absorbed a bunch of water.
And it tests higher.
Actually, I meant to say the other way around. You buy an ethanol fuel that's 75% ethanol, it can absorb more water. The next batch has only 55 and the water falls out of suspension. So the benefit of a race blended X85 is that ours contains a consistent 85%, and the VP X85 is blended with 15% C9, typical high octane unleaded fuel. We also sell an X98, and that's 98% ethanol and 2% unleaded high octane fuel. So not only are you getting the benefit of the consistency, you're also getting the benefit of the higher octane, higher energy value race fuel as compared to a pump gas, where you're not going to have either consistency or anything beyond a pump gas 87 octane fuel for the other 2%. The C85 is a different product in that it also contains those power producing components and nitromethane. It's also not something that a typical automotive fuel system is going to be able to adjust for, as most vehicles that are made to run on flex fuels can normally adjust with the onboard computer. Okay, what percentage of ethanol have I got this time? And that's built in. That's something that the car's computer can adjust for and compensate for.
Okay, so in general, like how you said there with the X85 and the X98, with the difference between them mainly being obviously the ethanol content and the octane number, do you see any difference when you go to much higher ethanol numbers like 98 in terms of making more power, making less power, or is it more for economy, if you want to say it that way?
Generally, the higher ethanol blends are not specifically for making more power, but generally providing more of the quench factor that we talked about earlier. So because of the low boiling point, ethanol is not that much higher in octane, but it acts like a much higher octane because of that quench effect that it has.
Cylinders cooling your intake charge.
Right. That's right. And because of the volume you put in there, more air and fuel in the combustion chamber. In fact, the other thing is with ethanol enhanced fuels or ethanol blends, even in turbocharged cars, what you're trying to do is to stop detonation and then let the turbocharger or the supercharger make the horsepower for you. In a naturally aspirated engine, the ethanol tends to kill your power if you're running 10% or 20% as compared to all gasoline, because gasoline has a better energy value per pound.
I think it's like a drop of ethanol versus a drop of gasoline. It's a drop of ethanol is like 65% or 64% of the caloric energy. In other words, what can be produced out of that drop.
That's right.
Gasoline is always bigger boom, but the bigger boom, while it may seem like it's better, is actually worse for you because you're not getting the quenching and the other cooling factors that you get with more exotic mixtures, if you want to say it that way.
Right. So you have a choice. You can run higher octanes to prevent your detonation, because that's going to limit rather how much boost or cylinder pressure you can put into the motor. And cylinder pressure, as you know, is affected not only by static compression ratio, how big the piston is, but it can be affected by things like cam shafts, cam timing, ignition timing, all of those things, or the turbochargers, superchargers that we talked about as well. Those things all affect cylinder pressure.
Okay. With the other thing too, before I think Khaled has a question for you, kind of leading into the sustainability aspect, with some of the biofuels. With So if someone is switching from, let's say, more of the traditional fuels or from pump gas, and they're going to go to an ethanol-based fuel, C85, X85, something like that, what would kind of be the considerations that they need to take, other than obviously larger injectors in the fuel system to be able to handle that? But what's a good starting point for them if they're doing some of their own tuning, or they need to lay it over to their tuner with ignition timing differences, fueling differences? As you said, it's usually about double for ethanol over pump gasoline in terms of the volume of fuel that's required. Do you have like a generalization for what kind of ignition timing on top of what you would be running on your pump gas map would be? Like 4 degrees, 5 degrees is a good starting point, or is it very application dependent?
This is going to be a very specific question related to applications, and there are too many variables. Here is where you want to really work with your engine builder, your tuner. That oxygen sensor is a very valuable tool to give you some good starting points. And again, the timing certainly can affect the parameters of what your motor can run in without having detonation. So just because you know the static compression ratio, I'm putting a 10-to-1 piston in, that tends to be meaningless when you have a camshaft profile and camshaft timing and turbocharger output, or that will change all of the tuning parameters. But as you mentioned, the basic considerations are that the spark plug, the fuel pressure, the fuel injectors, all of those things have to be modified. And as I mentioned earlier, the increased service of the motor, along with trying to maintain some temperature in that engine in these big nitrous or big ethanol-based systems.
All right, Mark, so I had a quick one for you. Since we have you here, what's new? What's new coming down the line for VP? What can we expect? Is there anything new that you guys will be offering to Paul that the residents and racers of Antigua can expect, so to speak? Is there anything new that you guys are working on?
I wish I had something great to share with you. I think right now it's more about small tweaks. You know, when Steve Burns started the company in the mid-70s, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit. But most of the big gains we've already found. Now, that's not to say we're not finding different combinations of components. And now, because we're able to look into combustion chambers and actually see what's going on there in thousands of frames per second, that we aren't learning things about whether it's combustion swirl or injector designs. Those things are finding horsepower and they're creating economies, whether it's fuel mileage or eking out more horsepower. But I don't see any dramatic changes.
So you guys are basically constantly doing research and development, you know, revising formulas if need be. Is that something that happens quite often for y'all, or no?
Well, quite frankly, I'd like to see more R&D, but you know, on a personal note, and I'm sure I'll be vilified for this if it's broadcast.
Promise we won't get you into trouble.
The new company seems more focused on some of the consumer products, the additives, the licensing agreements, and diversifying beyond racing fuel And if I can use the old school, old timers comment again, a lot of us would like to see more R&D in the race fuel, on the race fuel side, rather than the emphasis on branded gas stations and consumer goods. So if you want to strain my already tenuous relationship with the new owner, go ahead and put that out there. And, you know, and I'm sure that despite the fact that we are VP's largest distributor of race fuel, then I'm sure they'll find a way to, you know, to torture me a little bit more.
So Mark, I want to interject a little there and help you to build that relationship back. So tell me a little bit about those additives for those of us who we don't have a race car, we just have a regular car, and I know there's some VP products out there that you can just put into your gas tank to help you out. What are some of
Sure.
those?
And so the octane boosters are just that. We talked a little bit before about raising octane and octane numbers not necessarily being relative to horsepower, but protecting the motor from that damaging detonation. Very destructive. So octane boosters serve a role in that if you have, whether you've created by virtue of the static compression ratios or by virtue of the cylinder pressure that you've created, whether that's by turbocharging, supercharging, or even chemical supercharging, valve timing and whatnot, if you've created more cylinder pressure and therefore more heat when that air-fuel mixture is compressed, now you have detonation concerns. To prevent detonation, these components, these octane boosters have a purpose. One of the components that's used in everybody's octane booster, especially for the unleaded fuels, is manganese. It's also known as MMT, and it was used as far back as World War II. In some of the highly modified aircraft piston engines that we needed in order to get those things to boost the output. They also used, by the way, water injection, which has become also very popular. You mix a combination of methanol and water and spray it into the intake manifold, and it quenches temperature and again, helps prevent detonation. But getting back to your octane boosters, the leaded octane booster actually contains some C16, and that's why it is so very effective at raising octane. That's the purple can. Yep. We have a new version,
The unleaded.
The unleaded, which is a green can, and which we have quite a high demand for, but my personal experiences have led me to caution users, especially in areas of the world where the fuel quality is very low in terms of octane. In those cases, and in many of these countries, we've seen the steady use of the unleaded octane booster, despite the used as directed and the using according to directed, I should say, and used very frequently. We've seen some damage to the oxygen sensors. We've seen some deposits to the catalytic converter, and I've seen some destruction of the fine wire spark plugs as well. So I want to caution any users of of the VP octane booster, as well as other competitive brands. They're using this MMT, which is manganese. It's also a heavy metal like tetraethyl lead. And there's an exemption under the EPA laws that allow this to be used in octane boosters, but they should be very careful and use minimally to prevent damage to these components. Now, again, as I mentioned before, if you're going to have a detonation, it's cheaper to replace an O2 sensor,
Yeah.
even a catalytic converter and spark plugs, than it is a piston. So you have to stop the detonation. So that may not be the answer that the manufacturer would like to have me tell, but that's my real concern. Use the octane boosters to prevent detonation, but be careful because they can leave manganese deposits on the spark plugs. These are easily identified when you look at your spark plug. They'll be orange at the electrode.
Mark, I just want to say a big thank you to you. Is there any final comments you want to make? I can see that you have a wealth of information. We could be here for hours. Anything you want to put out there just as we wrap up?
I want to thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to discuss these products and address the questions that you had. Again, hopefully I haven't been overly technical, and I've explained it in a way that made sense to everyone, but I'm always available should you have any other questions. On the VP brochure, there's a tech hotline, and my office located in Fort Lauderdale. You can reach me anytime at either sales at vpsoutheast.com, or you can reach me personally at mklein@vpsoutheast.com.
All right. Thanks much, Mark. And it's truly been a wonderful time. Thank you. We thank Paul for having us for this session. And do enjoy the rest of your day. I'm sure we're going to have another time. We're going to call you in to pick your brain some more sort of stuff.
I think there's a lot more we could go over, but again, we don't want to take up too much more of your time. This may be something which we'll do ongoing in the future, and if you're happy to come back, we're always happy to have you.
Thanks, gentlemen. I appreciate it. And if I didn't have a surfboard to and the opportunity to spend more time with my 16-year-old daughter, I would love to spend more time, and I'm happy to come back and use what you can. And if we need to redo stuff, I'm sure I can make time to address that. So once again, I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity. Great to meet all of you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
Likewise,
Thanks,
Mark.
man.
Thanks again for your time, and greatly appreciated, man.
Take care, gentlemen.
All right. Take care. Have a good one.